The Ultranova's modulation matrix allows us to control the synth parameters with modulation sources such as keyboard velocity, the 6 envelopes, the 3 LFOs, and more. There are 20 modulation slots within the matrix, allowing for a wide scope of modulation possibilities. Each slot also has a secondary source which controls the amplitude or depth of the first source. Therefore, it's pretty easy to create some fairly intense modulation setups with Ultranova. To patch up a modulation source to a destination, we hit the modulation button, and now we can access our 20 modulation slots. To edit a slot, we can use the first control knob to choose the slot number, and by using the other control knobs, select which modulation sources to route to modulation destinations. The first patch wheel setup will control filter 1's cutoff frequency with the modulation wheel. To do this, we select modulation wheel under the source 1 control, choose the modulation destination, which will be filter 1 frequency, and let's bring the modulation depth up to +40. Now we can use the modulation wheel to sweep the filter. Note that the depth control is bipolar, so we can invert the direction of the modulation source. Now let's try something a little different. Let's have a look at setting the modulation wheel as our secondary source, and resetting source 1 to LFO 1. Note that there are 2 outputs from each LFO. One is bipolar, marked +/-, which will add and subtract to the current destination parameters setting, and the other is unipolar, marked with just a plus, which will only add to the parameter setting if the modulation depth is set as positive. Having the secondary source set as the modulation wheel means that the amplitude of LFO 1 will now be controlled by the modulation wheel. We can think of this as each modulation routing having its own controllable amplifier built in. The Ultranova's modulation matrix even allows us to create feedback paths between certain modulation sources. For example, I can control the rate of LFO1 with its own output. This can be useful for creating different LFO shapes, as well as creating some chaotic patches. Let's try setting this up in modulation slot 2. If I set source 1 to LFO1's unipolar output this time, the modulation destination to LFO1 rate, and the modulation depth to +25, we can now hear that the sinusoidal shape of LFO1 is being skewed. Again, we can assign a modulation source to source 2 to control by how much this skewing occurs. Let's set the keyboard velocity to source 2. Now, if we play softly, LFO1 modulates the cutoff with a fairly sinusoidal shape. Whilst if we play a little harder, LFO1's shape becomes increasingly skewed. Note that we can also use the touch controls to vary the depth of a modulation routing. By doing this, the touch knobs act as switches, turning the modulation on and off. Let's go back to our first modulation slot and apply touch 1 to the touch select parameter. Now, we can switch the LFO's routing to the cutoff frequency on and off by touching control knob 1 when in touch mode. Note that the modulation wheel is still controlling the depth of this LFO via source 2's setting.